everybody, welcome back. We're going to continue on today with the learning unit, talking about classical conditioning, but applying it to humans today rather than animals so much. So let's get on to it. So we talked about Pavlov was important for being the discoverer of classical conditioning with his dog experiment. And today we're going to talk about another really important guy. Both Pavlov and our guy today, John B. Watson, are very important psychologists from the behavioral perspective because we know that any form of associative learning, whether it be classical conditioning or operant conditioning, are both falling under the behavioral perspective that's kind of emphasizing rewards and punishments and like the environment being able to shape people's behavior. So John B. Watson is an important fellow, and I remember I think I showed this quote to us on the first or second day of class about how it's kind of controversial, and that he thought that he could apply classical conditioning principles that were used on animals to humans to kind of shape them into being whoever he wanted them to be. All right, so he says this quote: "Give me a dozen healthy infants, well formed in my own specified world to bring them up in, and I guarantee I can take anyone at random, make them anyone that I'd like, a doctor, lawyer, or even a beggar, man, or thief." Um, right, so he says that he can do this through things like classical conditioning, and this is a pretty controversial statement to make because remember we said that the behavioral perspective is very much emphasizing nurture. Um, and it almost feels like we can just be like, shaped into whoever we are by the world and that we don't really have as much agency as we think, that we're almost so shaped by our social environment that we don't have any control over our lives. So a little controversial. So John B. Watson is important to note because he is the one who says classical conditioning can be applied to humans too. So, how he does this is by setting up one of the most famous or infamous experiments in psychology called the Little Albert experiment. So, we'll watch this together for a sec here.
In the early part of the 20th century, psychologists John Watson and Rosalie Rayner set out to teach a baby boy called Little Albert to fear white rats using the principle of classical conditioning.
Okay,
This
so
is
here's
a film
Little
of
Albert.
their work. The film shows several phases of their study. First, as you see here, the investigators demonstrated that prior to conditioning, Little Albert had no fears of any animals, including, of course, white rats.
Okay, so white rat is the neutral stimulus, right? You'll see here they show him a variety of things, but one of the things is the white rat, and that's neutral. It doesn't cause him to feel any type of way. He's, pretty ambivalent, neutral towards it. So there you see, he's whatever about the white rat before conditioning occurs. Okay. So now we're going to get into classical conditioning actually occurring in just a sec here.
Watson and Rayner then sought to teach Albert to fear white rats through classical conditioning. In the conditioning phase of the study, which was not filmed, the investigators struck a steel bar with a hammer whenever Albert reached for a rat, making a very loud noise that greatly upset and frightened Albert. After 6 such pairings of the loud noise and the rat, it was believed that the boy had been conditioned to fear white rats. That is, Albert was now expected to react fearfully to white rats, whether the rats were paired with loud noises or not. In this next film sequence, we see Albert interacting with a white rat after the conditioning process.
Okay, so we see here that the unconditioned stimulus is the noise, right? Scary noises naturally make us have a fear, startle reaction. So unconditioned stimulus, loud noise, scary noise. Unconditioned response, fear, startle response. Neutral stimulus, white rat, he doesn't feel a type of way about it, but you pair that with the loud noise a bunch, and now we know white rat's going to become the conditioned stimulus, and the conditioned response is going to be what we're seeing here, this little fear response. He's upset.
The investigators believed that the child's reaction during this trial demonstrated his newly acquired fear of white rats. Finally, the investigators expected that little Albert's conditioned fear of white rats would generalize to stimuli that were similar in key ways to a white rat. In this film segment, they were trying to demonstrate that the child now also reacted fearfully to similar objects, such as a rabbit, a dog, a furry object, and a white mask worn by Watson himself.
So there you see here, that's an important term we're going to talk about called generalization. So little Albert is not only afraid of white rats, he generalizes. So this fear, this conditioned fear is applied to not only white rats, but all white furry things, a little teacup poodle, could be a little stuffed animal, right? He's generalizing this to all kind of white furry objects and things. So again, putting this all together in our formula, we know that loud, scary noises, in this case they said it's like the bang of a hammer they're using, that naturally causes your fear startle response. Neutral stimulus is our little white rat. Pair that with the loud startle, and then that's going to cause you the unconditioned response of fear. So right, do that so many times, and this is the fancy word for this during conditioning phase is called acquisition. So during the acquisition phase, you're pairing this together a bunch of times to the point where now conditioned stimulus, the white rat alone causes the fear response, right? It's no longer neutral. It is at that point where it's now conditioned stimulus. That alone causes the conditioned response. So like I said, important term to note is stimulus generalization. So this is again the idea that when a response has been conditioned, it often generalizes or overgeneralizes. So similar stimuli also elicit the same response. So in this case, maybe it's a little teacup. I don't know if you guys remember Pooh from Dr. Judy, but right, little Albert would not only be afraid of white rats, but also things like little Pooh Bear here, the dog, or a little stuffed animal, or just even like a white furry blanket or something, right? He is generalizing his fear to other similar stimuli. So even here, it could be like a doorbell, it could be like another, like a chime or a knock, right? So like similar noises because it elicits similar responses. So in the case of Pavlov, the dogs might salivate not only to like a little bell, like whatever, like the little chime they dinged. It could also be a doorbell. It also could be like a little, like a different sounding, like a bike bell, right? So he kind of overgeneralized. So the dogs are salivating not only at the sound of Pavlov's bell, but like other similar sounding noises. The opposite of stimulus generalization is called stimulus discrimination, which is being able to tell the difference between two stimuli. So if you are engaging in stimulus general or discrimination, you would be able to tell the difference between little Pooh Bear dog and a white rat, or wind chimes versus the little bell they use for Pavlov. So discrimination, right? You're kind of separating things you can think of. You can tell the difference. Like I said, the previous lesson, I didn't want to get all these terms in because we were just trying to get the basics of classical conditioning. But I said that conditioning means learning. So the process in which you're pairing together neutral stimulus, unconditioned response, all of that, I said that's called conditioning. The even fancier term for this is called acquisition. So let's go back here, like I said. Right, so the process of actually conditioning, where you're pairing all this together, is called acquisition. You are acquiring the conditioned response. Right, so it's just the pairing of neutral stimulus with unconditioned stimulus repeatedly. And we see here, this chart shows us nicely that the more times you are pairing these all together, the stronger you're going to have that conditioned response to the conditioned stimulus, right? The stronger that's going to be. Now we said though that like animals and humans, we're smarter than we think, right? We're gonna, like I said, we pick up on things, and that's why associative learning it makes sense, right? If you hear the crack of a can every time food opens, my cat's smart enough to be like, all right, like I hear the can, there's gonna be food. But they're also smart enough to realize that if you present the crack of a can without food multiple times, they're going to realize, like, all right, like, I guess the can doesn't cause food anymore, right? So that's what extinction is. It's unlearning a conditioned relationship or behavior. So it's pairing or it's presenting the conditioned stimulus multiple times without the unconditioned stimulus to the point where they realize, oh, this isn't a relationship, right? Like, um, the bell isn't causing food anymore. So, like, I don't need to have this, like, salvation relationship or response as a response to that. So, extinction is when they realize that the conditioned stimulus and the unconditioned stimulus are not together. So now the conditioned stimulus no longer elicits the conditioned response. Right. So you see here, the more time goes on of presenting just the conditioned stimulus alone, the weaker the conditioned response is, to the point where it just goes away altogether. So in Pavlov, it's putting the tone or the little bell multiple times by itself without the food, to the point where the dog picks up on it, and they're going to eventually stop salivating to the tone alone because they realize, this isn't causing food. So that is extinction, right? You're extinguishing or getting rid of that classically conditioned relationship. But an important term occurs sometimes after extinction has occurred. So, like I said, if something's extinguished, you are no longer, having that conditioned relationship. In Pavlov, they're no longer drooling at the sound of the bell alone. In Little Albert, he's no longer afraid of white furry things. He's fine. But sometimes something called spontaneous recovery occurs, and this is the reappearance of an extinguished response after the conditioned stimulus is presented. Um, so we see here, right? Extinction has occurred, there's a pause, and there's a point where, like, there's no relationship, there's no conditioned response anymore. But then we see randomly, you could be just out in the world, and, little Albert was doing fine with white furry things, and then one day he sees a little Fifi the dog walking down the street, a little white poodle, and then he gets scared. So that's spontaneous recovery. As extinction has occurred, they've been fine, they don't have this conditioned response anymore, but randomly it'll just pop up every once in a while. So same thing for Pavlov's dogs, right? Extinction occurred. Maybe they realize the tone or the bell does not cause food. They are no longer drooling at the sound of the bell. But then one day randomly a little cooking timer goes off, a little bell rings or whatever, and then they start drooling. So that's spontaneous recovery. So one last thing I wanted to bring up to us is classically conditioned taste aversions, and one last important psychologist to know when it comes to classical conditioning. And his name is John Garcia. John Garcia is another one where he wasn't intentionally studying classical conditioning. He was actually studying like rats and how they were responding to, like, radiation treatment. So he wasn't on the onset studying classical conditioning. So he was studying radiation treatment and how rats were responding to that. But then what they found is that he kind of, again, like Pavlov, noticed, something interesting is going on. The rats are, like, kind of grossed out and are sick by just looking at the little, like, plastic tray thing that their food comes in. And they come to realize that this is because the smell of plastic is making them sick. And the reason for the plastic smell making them sick is because radiation, if you think of people going through chemo, radiation therapy and stuff, it makes you sick. It makes you sick to your stomach. You feel really nauseous. You lose your appetite and things don't taste good anymore. And this is what's happening to the rats. So when they were getting radiation treatment, they were getting really sick, but they were drinking out of these and eating out of these plastic bowls. So then they kind of paired these things together in a classically conditioned way. So the taste of or smell of this plastic bowl alone is eliciting that nausea response because they form that classically conditioned taste aversion to it. So let's talk my example with Burger King that I brought up earlier. So we'll see how this works. So we have an unconditioned stimulus of just like tainted food that's, got like food poisoning, salmonella, whatever it is, right? Is going to naturally cause you to have the unconditioned response of like nausea and vomiting, right? That's a naturally occurring relationship. Now, we're going to pair just Burger King in general, right? So it was Burger King that I had that made me sick. So we pair a Burger King burger and food, and the smell of that, taste of that, with, it being some kind of tainted bacteria. And then that causes you to throw up, right? So now just the smell or taste of Burger King is going to make me kind of queasy and feel gross. The thing about taste aversions that's really interesting is how powerful they are. Whereas everything else with like little Albert and Pavlov and all those things we're seeing, it requires multiple pairings of things together. We see that taste aversions can just develop after one pairing, right? It just requires one experience of having like Burger King make you sick to cause that. So that's kind of the interesting thing here. That's how classically conditioned taste aversions occur. And it also bends the rules a little bit of classical conditioning in a way where they say that anything that you associate with something would cause you to like have that reaction. So ideally, like seeing Burger King or like looking at a picture of a burger or something would make you sick. In this case, it's really just the smell or taste that's making you sick. So, like, for example, if I was with my friend, or I was with my friend when this happened, I don't have an aversion towards her, right? I don't have this fear of her, even though she was next to me when all this happened. So it's really just like located just with like the smell and taste, which is kind of interesting. So it's not, kind of bending the rules of classical conditioning a bit, where it's saying it's not just anything that was paired with it. It's specifically, in this case, just only tastes and smells. So there you have it, everybody. Um, Tomorrow we're going to be moving on to another form of associative learning, which is operant conditioning. So have a nice